Hello everyone, this is Mike History 2, and welcome to the first video of 2022. So guys, I am going to do a year in review kind of recap video that's going to be coming out pretty soon. I should have done it before, but well, I've been kind of busy doing a lot of things. I didn't do one last year because I was in Hawaii, but I did one 2 years ago. So for those of you who were there 2 years ago, you'll probably have some idea what I'm talking about. But without further ado, let's get to the topic. So we are once again looking at some of the important ancestors of Queen Elizabeth II. And so we looked at some of her royal ancestors from England in the High Middle Ages as well as France, and so France is where we will pick up. So one of her major ancestors was Philip VI of France, who was the first French king of a new dynasty, the House of Valois. He became king in 1328, but this was immediately disputed since King Charles IV's nearest male relative was his nephew, Edward III of England, but the French nobles preferred his cousin Philip instead. Maybe it has something to do with Edward being English, I don't know. Although Edward initially accepted Philip's succession, they got into several disputes, which resulted in the outbreak of the 100 Years' War in 1337, which wasn't 100 years and also wasn't one war. Now, Philip suffered several crushing defeats, such as the annihilation of the French fleet in 1340 at the Battle of Sluis, and then the Battle of Crécy on land in 1346, and then the arrival of the Black Death only 2 years later, which further devastated the country. By 1349, he bought Dauphiné and died in 1350, being succeeded by his son John. Now, as for his ancestry, he was 2/3 French, 8.25% German, 7.25% Greek, 4.5% Dutch, 3.25% Italian, 2.25% Russian, 2% Spanish, 1% English, 0.75% Scottish, 0.75% Breton, 0.5% Czech, Serbian, and Hungarian. And as you will see, as we get further and further to the present, the ethnic mix of these monarchs becomes ever more complicated. So, meanwhile, John was in an even worse situation than his father, since he succeeded during the Black Death, which literally killed half the population, and also had to deal with the peasant uprising known as the Jacquerie in 1358, along with mercenary bands that were plundering the country. Militarily, the French suffered another crushing defeat at Poitiers in 1356, and he was even taken prisoner, causing his son, the future Charles V, to become regent. Charles was only able to liberate his father 4 years later, after paying a ransom as part of the Treaty of Bretigny, in which France lost a lot of land as well. Nevertheless, in exchange for his freedom, his second son Louis, Duke of Anjou, was taken hostage, and after he escaped, John voluntarily returned to England, where he died in 1364. And as for him, he was 71% French, 13.25% German, 3.75% Greek, 2.75% Italian, 2.5% Dutch and Spanish, 1.5% Russian, 0.75% English and Scottish, 0.5% Breton, and 0.25% Czech, Serbian, and Hungarian. His son, Charles, was not unlucky, unlike his father, and he made efforts to restore French glory. He established the first permanent army paid with regular wages, which finally solved the problem of roaming mercenaries who were unpaid. Under the leadership of Bertrand du Guesclin, he was able to turn the tide of the 100 Years' War, and by the end of his reign was able to reconquer almost all the land lost at the Treaty of Bretigny. He also restored the French navy and replenished the treasury, and by his death in 1380 had brought France back to a high point. He was only just over half French, however, being just over a quarter German, 4.5% Dutch, 3.75% Greek and Russian, 2.25% Italian, 1.5% Spanish, 1.25% Polish, 0.5% English and Scottish, and 0.25% Breton. Now, things were looking good for France, but all his progress would be undone by his son, Charles VI, who succeeded him at age 12, and although placed under the regency of his uncles, by age 20 he became the actual ruler of France. In 1392, while leading an expedition against Brittany, he suffered an attack of delirium, during which he attacked his own men and just months later nearly died in a fire caused by a torch brought by his brother at a ball. After this, he was once again placed under the regency of his uncles, and from then on alternated between periods of madness and sanity. His younger brother Louis I, Duke of Orleans, grew in influence, but his rivalry with John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, plunged France into a civil war. To make things worse, his army was crushed by the English at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, which resulted in him disinheriting his son in favor of his future son-in-law, Henry V of England. But Henry's death in 1422 resulted in the House of Valois being given the chance to continue fighting in the 100 Years' War, despite Charles dying the same year. Now, as for him, he was 61.75% French, 20% German, 5.25% Dutch, 3.5% Greek, 2.25% Russian and Italian, 1.5% Spanish, 1% English, Scottish, and Polish, and 0.5% Breton. So we've looked at a lot of French kings. It's only normal now. We'll look at some other rulers. So another important ancestor of hers, and this is going a little back in time, was Rudolf I of Germany, who was the first Habsburg king of Germany. Now he became Count of Habsburg in 1239, but his election as King of Germany in 1273 marked the end of the Great Interregnum, which had gone on since the death of Frederick II, who I have mentioned in a previous video. In 1276 he became Duke of Carinthia and Carniola, and 2 years later became the Duke of Austria and Styria, taking those territories from King Ottokar II of Bohemia at the Battle of the Markfeld. Although only ruling Austria and Styria until 1282 and Carinthia and Carniola until 1286, his legacy was raising the House of Habsburg from a minor family to the rank of imperial princes by his death in 1291. And who knows, maybe we'll hear more about these Habsburg people. Now, as for his ancestry, he was basically completely German, but was 0.75% French. Another ancestor who restored an empire was Michael VIII Palaiologos, who became Emperor of Nicaea in 1259, a successor state to the Eastern Roman Empire, which had been destroyed by the Fourth Crusade in 1204, and 2 years later reconquered Constantinople, thus restoring the empire. As emperor, he recovered a lot of the Eastern Roman Empire's power and enlarged its army and navy and reconstructed Constantinople, thus boosting its population. He also restored the University of Constantinople, which led to the Palaiologan Renaissance that lasted long after his death in 1282. Now we're going even further back in time to the Normans, and an important ancestor that Elizabeth had was a guy you might have heard of called Robert Guiscard, and he was a French adventurer who participated in the Norman conquest of southern Italy and became Duke of Apulia and Calabria from 1057 to 1085. However, his son, Bohemond I of Antioch, became even more famous as the most experienced leader of the First Crusade. He became Prince of Taranto in 1088, and after conquering Antioch in 1098 during the Crusade, became its first prince, ruling it until his death in 1111. Now he was half French through his father, Robert Guiscard, and half Italian through his mother. If that wasn't cool enough, Elizabeth has even more Crusader blood, being descended from Baldwin II of Jerusalem, who also led the First Crusade and became Count of Edessa in 1100, ruling it until 1118, after which he became King of Jerusalem. However, in 1104, he was captured at the Battle of Haran and was only released 4 years later after he was ransomed by his cousin. Only a year after becoming King of Jerusalem, the army of Antioch was almost completely annihilated, and he became regent for the absent prince Bohemond II. However, the frequent Seljuk invasions of Antioch caused him to spend most of his time there, which caused anger in Jerusalem. He was again captured in 1123 and released a year later, after which he tried to capture Aleppo but was forced to abandon the siege in 1125. To raise money for his conquest of Damascus, he married off his daughter Melusine to the wealthy Fulk V of Anjou, and with Fulk's help, began the invasion, but never reached Damascus, and Bohemond II was killed in 1130. He then assumed the regency for his daughter Constance in Antioch, but fell ill and went to Jerusalem, where he died in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1131. Now finally, one other important ancestor that we are covering here is Bela IV of Hungary. He was the oldest son of Andrew II of Hungary and was crowned at age 8 by a group of important nobles, but his father refused to acknowledge it for another 6 years until 1220, when he became Duke of Slavonia. In 1226, he dropped that title and became instead the first Duke of Transylvania, and as Duke supported Christian missionaries to the pagan Cumans in the country. Once his father finally died in 1235, he succeeded him as King of Croatia and Hungary. However, he was most known as the King of Hungary during the Mongol invasion led by the Golden Horde in 1241, with his army being massacred at the Battle of Mohi. Although he escaped, the Mongols chased him as far as Trogir on the Adriatic coast and devastated the country before unexpectedly withdrawing the next year. After the invasion, thousands of settlers from the Holy Roman Empire, Poland, and other neighboring areas arrived to settle the depopulated areas, and because of his efforts to rebuild the country, he became known as its second founder. In 1254, he conquered Styria but lost it to King Ottokar II of Bohemia 4 years later. As he grew older, his relationship with his oldest son grew tense because of favoritism shown towards his siblings, which caused a civil war from 1264 to 1265. And Bela died in 1270. He was half German, interestingly enough, a fifth French, 8% Russian, 8% Greek, 3% Serbian, and only 2.5% Hungarian, although he was also 2.5% English, 1.5% Czech and Italian, 1% Sorb, 0.75% Danish and Swedish, and 0.5% Dutch. Now, that is all for today. I hope you learned something interesting. I'm sure you must have learned at least one new thing, so definitely, if you are here for the first time, don't forget to subscribe, and for the regular viewers, don't forget to like and share, and I'll see you next time.